Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is No Soundbites Allowed, and I am your host, Michael Voss, the political dragon here in our offices in the Bronx, New York. And it's November 24th, approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. Joe Biden, a little over an hour ago, made some comments about the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, the release so far of approximately 24 out of 50 hostages. And I think it's very important that we understand exactly what he had to say in the 10 minutes that he gave to this international incident, this very serious issue that involves the United States as well as several nations around the world. So what we will do today is we're going to go through and we're going to listen to exactly what he said. We're going to do a deep dive on his statements as he presented them to the American people and the world to see what is true, what is embellishment, and what is political theater to help the 2024 election. We hope you will enjoy this deep dive of his statements. Now, as you may not be aware, but we are going to C-SPAN and using their coverage of his words. So this has not been edited in any way by any news media. These are the exact words of Joe Biden. Let's hear what he has to say.
Yesterday, families all across America gathered together with their loved ones and to give thanks. We must be thankful for in America.
I would agree with that statement. There is much to be thankful for in America. We are the leader of the world in terms of freedom, economy, quality of life. When you put it all together, there is no nation quite like America, and God bless America. So far, he started off well.
Food on our tables, the family and loved ones in our homes, and the many blessings that come from living in the greatest nation on earth. Today, we can also be thankful of families being recruited and reunited with loved ones who have been held hostage for nearly 50 days.
Okay, for Americans recruited, obviously, this was a misstatement by Joe Biden. He misread his teleprompter and said recruited. The Americans and the individuals from multiple nations that were taken hostage by Hamas on October 7th in their act of global terror, well, they weren't recruited. This wasn't voluntary. They were captured. They were forcibly either killed or taken hostage, many of them tortured, many of them sexually abused, and they have been held as human shields. I give Joe Biden, he made a flub. These things happen, whether you're doing something live or whether you're doing something that's recorded. People make mistakes in their words. That's fine. Let's go on.
Beginning this morning, under a deal reached by extensive U.S. diplomacy, including numerous calls I've made from the Oval Office to leaders across the region, fighting in Gaza will halt for 4 days.
Joe Biden is saying this as if he has taken exclusive control over the negotiations between Israel and Hamas. In fact, multiple nations around the globe and the UN have been insisting on a ceasefire for 3 weeks now. So it's not Joe Biden alone. He made phone calls, but so did many other nations. And in fact, as we have learned today from reporting, countries such as Thailand have actually gone on their own without the Biden administration, speaking directly with Hamas and Iran, as well as Israel, for negotiations of their citizens that were taken hostage by Hamas in their terrorist act on October 7th. So this isn't just Joe Biden, although it sounds great for a voter base that doesn't know about international news and only looks at the sound bites, the headlines that come from American news media, which is heavily edited when it comes to what's been happening with Israel and Hamas. But let's go on.
This deal also is structured to allow a pause to continue for more than 50 hostages to be released. That's our goal. This morning, I've been engaged with my team as we began the first difficult days of implementing this deal. It's only a start.
Joe Biden is saying that he's very deeply involved, that the Biden-Harris administration are deeply involved in getting the hostages released from Hamas as if he was Israel. He's not. This is something that has to do with Israel. It has to do with Hamas. Perhaps you could say even Iran, as they fund and control Hamas, as well as Hezbollah and the Houthis out of Yemen. But the Biden administration has very little to almost nothing to do with the negotiations or the release of the hostages. This includes American hostages. Let's take a moment to remember that on October 7th, over 33 Americans were killed by Hamas. These are civilians we're talking about. And over 22 Americans were taken hostage at a minimum by Hamas. So let's put that in perspective and let's continue.
So far, it's gone well. Early this morning, 13 Israeli hostages were released, including an elderly woman, a grandmother, and mothers with their young children, some under the age of 6 years old.
The nature of the deal that was created between Hamas and Israel was for the mostly women and children that were taken hostage, used as human shields, tortured and sexually abused by Hamas, for 150 Palestinians that were arrested by Israel in trying to remove Hamas from the Gaza Strip. So that's the deal itself. 3-1. For every one hostage released, 3 Palestinians would be released. That's the deal. And it just so happens that most of the people that were taken hostage and not killed by Hamas were women and children, to emphasize their use as a human shield. Let's continue.
Separately, several Thai nationals and Filipino nationals were also kidnapped by Hamas on the 7th. They were released as well.
He glossed over this a little bit, but it's actually huge news. Yes, 13 Israelis were released, but there were in addition 12 individuals from Thailand, as we mentioned, because of the negotiations of Thailand on its own with Iran and with Hamas directly, not with the Biden administration. In addition to that, one Filipino, one person from the Philippines, was released in addition to the 13 Israelis. So this is a big deal. This is emphasizing that there were many international individuals, civilians, that were captured and or killed on October 7th. Why is Joe Biden minimizing this? Why is he glancing over this? I don't know. Other than the fact that he can't take credit for the negotiations of the release of prisoners from the Philippines and the release of the prisoners from Thailand. They had nothing to do with the Biden-Harris administration. That's purely those nations, Israel and Hamas, maybe some influence by Iran, but nothing to do with the United States or Joe Biden. That's most likely why he's glossing past it, in case any Americans actually looked up the news or paid attention to the international news and realized he had no influence on this. But let's continue.
All of these hostages have been through a terrible ordeal. And this is the beginning of a long journey of healing for them. The teddy bears waiting to greet those children at the hospital are a stark reminder of the trauma these children have been through, and at such a very young age. Jill and I, Jill's with me here, keeping them all in our prayers today.
Why did he mention Jill? Completely meaningless, unnecessary, except it emphasizes that Joe Biden is a family man, that his family is involved in this, that their hearts and concerns are with these hostages, these former hostages and former human shields that suffered under Hamas. He's looking for sympathy. He's trying to gain your sympathy for his position and to try and show that he has empathy with families and individuals around the world. That's all this is.
Today has been a product of a lot of hard work and weeks of personal engagement. From the moment Hamas kidnapped these people, I, along with my team, have worked around the clock to secure their release.
That's somewhat questionable. Since the initial release, what we have seen is Joe Biden initially stated that he stood with Israel, which is perfectly fine. I have no problem with that. And he directly denounced the terrorist act of Hamas under the guidance of Iran. Perfectly fine. He then also started negotiations through Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State for the United States, behind the backs of the Israelis to speak directly with Hamas to try to negotiate for American hostages. And fine, I have no problem with that. That's what a leader of a nation should do, and that is what he did. But I wouldn't call it around the clock. And what he did succeed in getting is 2 out of at least 24 American hostages released at the price tag of $105 million in humanitarian aid. Aid that invariably must go through the governing body of Gaza, which is Hamas, the elected leadership of Gaza. So he made a deal with terrorists, something that is explicitly and expressly forbidden by the United States laws and legislation. It's something that we should not be paying, but he did. Let's go on.
We saw the first results of this effort with the release of 2 American hostages in late October, followed by the release of 2 Israeli hostages.
The Israeli hostages and the American hostages are 2 separate events. The Israeli hostages having to do with Israel's negotiations with Hamas and the interference of Iran, not with the United States. Joe Biden, Secretary Antony Blinken, expressly and specifically were negotiating with Hamas for Americans, not for Israelis. They're not the same thing. Joe Biden is trying to take credit that he did not earn, that his administration was not involved with.
I've consistently pressed for a pause in the fighting.
He did not. Joe Biden has not. He started to insist on, and as we look through the time frame, throughout October, Joe Biden wasn't emphasizing that there should be a ceasefire or a pause as much as he was listening to the leftist wing of the Democratic Party, the Democratic Socialists of America, the colleges around America like Harvard, like Cooper Union, like Cornell University, where students came out and claimed that they are pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas. In fact, students at Cornell University declared themselves members of Hamas, a terrorist organization, which shows you the level of indoctrination there. But it was only until about November that we truly saw Joe Biden stepping up to the pressure from his own wing of the party to support his reelection goals and started supporting a ceasefire of some sort. But that's not something that he unilaterally and initially was trying to do.
For 2 reasons: to accelerate and expand humanitarian assistance going into Gaza, and 2, to facilitate the release of hostages.
He did try to emphasize the humanitarian aid. Again, that was the initial thing, which was part of the conditions of the 2 Americans that were released initially. Of course, again, the humanitarian aid is a question because we have seen historically and continuously at least some, if not all of the humanitarian aid will reach and be diverted to Hamas, a terrorist organization that runs Gaza. At some point, either by force or by natural process, they get all of the humanitarian aid. And we have seen them consistently hoard that humanitarian aid, whether it be fuel or water, food, or items that they can convert into weapons like rockets, have been consistently hoarded by Hamas for its fight and not for the people of Gaza. So there are some questions here, but let's continue.
And over the past several weeks, I've spoken repeatedly with the Emir of Qatar, the President Sisi of Egypt, and Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel to help secure this deal, to nail it down. And I want to thank all 3 leaders for their personal partnership to get this done.
The influence of the United States in this process is questionable at best. It is true that Qatar is one of the nations that has been involved. That's because the headquarters of Hamas is in Qatar. So, in fact, he wasn't talking to the nation of Qatar, he was talking to Hamas, which is run by Iran. That's just the reality of it. So, yes, the negotiations were between Egypt, Hamas in Qatar, their headquarters, and Israel, with some influence by the United States. It is disputed internationally how much that influence was part of these negotiations. Let's continue.
I spoke with the Emir and President al-Sisi and the Prime Minister Netanyahu again on Wednesday to confirm the elements of the engagement. As I said, today's release are the start of a process. We expect more hostages to be released tomorrow, and more the day after, and more the day after that.
That's because it's a 4-day ceasefire. So they didn't release everyone all at once, just as Israel isn't releasing all of their prisoners all at once. This is to ensure that each day of the ceasefire will be a ceasefire, to ensure that neither Hamas nor Israel jump the gun and return to the war that has not ended. Let's be very clear. This is not the end of the war. Israel is still seeking out Hamas, and they still intend to remove Hamas, that terrorist organization, from existing, since Hamas, by its charter, its words, and its actions, is trying to commit genocide against all of Israel, and they wouldn't mind taking out Americans along with that, as per the directive of Iran, which is the nation funding the attacks against Israel. Let's continue.
Over the next few days, we expect that dozens of hostages will be returned to their families. We also remember all those who are still being held.
This is critical. So Joe Biden has said, yes, there will be dozens, because if to get to 50, you have several dozen. So he's not incorrect there. Although he's trying to emphasize these words to make it sound greater than what it actually is. Because this represents 50 is about 1/5 the total number of hostages that are known internationally to be held as human shields by Hamas at this time. And he goes on to say that he wants to remember the others. I want you to note this point in the C-SPAN coverage in the comments by Joe Biden. Does he mention the American hostages? Again, we know of at least 22 American hostages that remain as human shields being tortured and abused by Hamas. Let's see what he actually remembers and tells the American people.
We renew our commitment to work for their release as well. 2 American women and 1 4-year-old child, Abigail, who remains among those missing. We also will not stop until we get these hostages brought home.
So at this point, Joe Biden has mentioned 2 hostages that Antony Blinken negotiated for, that he paid has proposed to pay $105 million in humanitarian aid, and 3 others, 2 women, 1 child. He has mentioned 5 American hostages, so that any American who is unaware of all of the information that came out in October, the international news that has been spoken about this since that time, since October 7th, that there are 22, at least 22 Americans being held hostage, and he's mentioned 5. So the expectation for the average American, as this is going to be chopped up by the American news media, and only 1 minute, minute and a half, 30 seconds, sound bites will be used to send this message to the rest of America, to those who don't follow the news, don't follow international news, and are just going to hear a headline about this. He makes it sound like there's only 5 hostages to bring home. Now, part of the reason why he would do that is the law of low expectations. He has lowered the expectations to the average American to hearing about 3 American hostages being returned. If he were to get 3 hostages, the 2 women and 1 child, based on just this coverage, most Americans would think all American hostages have been returned home, that America's involvement in the Israel-Hamas war would be at an end, that there is no more connection to the United States. That's not accurate. That isn't even close to accurate. There are 4 times as many Americans still being held that he has not mentioned, that he has not named. We don't know if they are men or women or additional children. He refuses to discuss that. He refuses to give us the full scope and the fact that the reason why America is involved in this is Americans were killed and Americans were taken hostage. Something that we have gone to war before just for these same reasons. So he has limited his culpability and the negative impact on him politically. Very few Americans were involved, and he has already achieved almost half of all those Americans being returned. That's the impression you would get if you're only following the sound bites coming from the left-leaning news media. But that is highly inaccurate. Let's go on.
In answer to our whereabouts, I remain in personal contact with the leaders of Qatar, Egypt, and Israel to make sure this stays on track and every aspect of the deal is implemented. This extended pause in the fighting brings a critical opportunity to deliver much-needed food, medicine, water, and fuel to the civilians in Gaza, and we are not wasting one single minute.
But will the food, medicine, fuel, and water reach the citizens of Gaza? In every other instance, in every other example over decades, that's not what happened. Hamas, the governing body of Gaza and a terrorist organization, always divert some, if not all, of the humanitarian aid that goes into Gaza every year. Well over $100 million is received by Gaza from Iran every year. The United States, under the Biden-Harris administration, have committed over $300 million in humanitarian aid to Gaza prior to October 7th. So it's not that they haven't received humanitarian aid for decades. It's that the people never get to receive it because Hamas diverts it and uses it for its ongoing attempted genocide of the people of Israel and other nations around the world. That's why they're terrorists. Let's go on.
Since my trip to Israel last month, I've been focused on accelerating the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza,
which is part of the deal he made to get the 2 Americans home. It's part of his purchase, his payments for those American hostages.
In coordination with the United Nations and the Red Cross. I just spoke with my special envoy for the Middle East humanitarian issues, David Satterfield, for an update. And I've asked him to monitor our progress hour by hour and keep me personally informed. From the beginning, we put in place mechanisms to prevent Hamas from diverting these supplies.
There is no way to prevent Hamas from diverting the supplies. In fact, the humanitarian aid that has been received, that has been coming through Egypt and into Gaza, parts of that have already been diverted by Hamas. And we have seen that Hamas in the south, where Israel is not involved, where Israel is not bombing or shelling, where it's just Hamas and many refugees trying to escape from Gaza, there has been fighting, and Hamas has been restricting individuals from being able to leave the West Bank, and they have been intercepting the humanitarian aid coming into Gaza. In fact, limiting the number of fuel tanks and water that has been able to come in and diverting many of those supplies. Joe Biden isn't giving the exact truth here. He knows this information. It's been reported internationally. He's just neglecting to tell the American people.
And we're continuing that effort to make sure aid gets to the people who need it. More than 200 trucks arrived at the crossing point in Egypt into Gaza today. These trucks carry food and medicine, as well as fuel and cooking gas. The fuel will be used not only to power the trucks delivering these life-saving supplies, but for desalination, for water wells, for hospitals, and for bakeries.
Again, he leaves out the question, how much of it will actually reach the people? There's more than enough water and wells in Gaza for the people of Gaza. It's just that Hamas is diverting that, as well as for the hospitals. He's also not being very honest about there's 200 trucks that could go from Egypt into Gaza. How many are actually going in? And that, again, is solely on the heads of Hamas. They're the ones restricting how many trucks get in and what gets in. So he's playing with the logistics and the realities that exist.
And hundreds more trucks are getting in position as well, ready to enter Gaza over the coming days to support the innocent Palestinians who are suffering greatly because of this war that Hamas has unleashed. Hamas doesn't give a damn about that.
I agree. Hamas doesn't care about Palestinians. Neither do the people of the Middle East. Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. They don't care about the Palestinians. They never have. There is no nation of Palestine, and none of these nations want those refugees. By the way, these are refugees that I guarantee you Democrats will insist must come to America, which is a question all its own. But the Middle East doesn't want them.
We also look to the future. As we look to the future, we have to end this cycle of violence in the Middle East. We need to renew our resolve to pursue this two-state solution, where Israelis and Palestinians can one day live side by side in a two-state solution.
You cannot create a two-state solution when one of those states has documented and stated that they want to eliminate, to genocide the other state. It doesn't work. So this is a problem. Besides the fact that the United States really has no place in the middle of that discussion. That is a discussion between the people of Palestine in Gaza and the West Bank and Israel, between Hamas and Israel. And yes, Iran is involved, and perhaps the United States has a place in trying to keep Iran, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, the other nations out of this discussion. But that's a discussion for Israel and the people in the West Bank and in Gaza, not the United States. And on top of that, again, the people of Gaza elected Hamas, a terrorist organization whose only stated and written and documented purpose is to genocide Israel. You cannot have two states when that is your core value. It isn't about voting. It isn't about opportunities of living. It isn't even the standard of living. It is the fact that Hamas wants to eliminate Israel. You can't have two states when that is the purpose of one of those two states. This isn't difficult to understand. The problem isn't about economics. It's not about politics. It is absolutely about existence. Israel will allow Palestine to exist. That's why that's why Gaza exists, why the West Bank exists. They allow that to exist. They don't have to. But Hamas wants to eliminate Israel. We have to understand that when people talk about the two-state solution, that is the nature of the two states. Israel will coexist with others, but Hamas will not.
With equal measure of freedom and dignity. Two states for two peoples. And it's more important now than ever. Hamas unleashed this terrorist attack because they fear nothing more than Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace. To continue down the path of terror and violence and killing and war is to give Hamas what they seek. We can't do that. So today, let's continue to be thankful for all the families who are now and those who will soon be brought together again.
Will any of those individuals who are now or in the next 3 days released and returned to their families, will any of them be Americans? Notice Joe Biden hasn't said Americans will be coming home. This is the primary purpose of the American government. In fact, this is the primary purpose of any government, to protect their people. Is Joe Biden doing that? He hasn't said that there has been, that as part of the deal, the initial discussions about these release of hostages, that even one American will be released. Why is he not saying that? If he is so deeply involved, if he understands and is helping to make sure that every part of this process, of all the hostages being released, that he's on top of this, his people are reporting every hour about this, then why does he not know, or at least not tell the American people, how many Americans are held hostage and when they will be coming, when will they be released? When will they come home? He isn't answering that. And you should be asking the question, Why? Either that means he's not as involved in the process as he is touting himself as being, or that there is something else, that these Americans aren't coming home. He knows it and doesn't want to say so because it would reflect badly politically for him, both amongst Democrats and every other American. This is critical, and we should pay attention to that.
I want to once again thank the Emir of Qatar, President Sisi of Egypt, and Prime Minister Netanyahu for their partnership to make what we've done so far possible, and for their continued leadership as we all keep working to implement this deal. And over the coming days, I'll remain engaged with leaders throughout the Middle East as we all work together to build a better future for the region.
One of the most important things that Joe Biden can do at this moment is to try and insist on the peace deal being worked on in September between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That's where he can be most influential and the most important, as well as to continue to have American aircraft carriers in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, to ensure that other nations like Jordan, like Egypt, like Syria, and Iran do not directly get involved. Yes, terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and the Houthis continue to attack Israeli civilians, but the nations are not, because the United States is in the way. That's great. Joe Biden is doing a good job there. It's the rest of it that he needs to work on in promoting the peace process started by the Abraham Accords that have been built upon by Israel and Saudi Arabia. That's what he needs to focus on. At least that is our interpretation. Let's go on.
Future where this kind of violence is unthinkable. A future where all children in the region, every child, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, grow up knowing only peace.
Well, that would be very difficult considering Iran doesn't believe in that. And Iran is the leading sponsor of global terror in the world.
That's what we do. We're waiting now. Just a matter of, I thought, maybe even as soon as by the time I got here. But in the next hour or so, we'll know what the second wave of releases are. And I'm hopeful that it's as we anticipate.
Does that mean it will involve, does the second wave or the third or the fourth involve Americans being released? This is important. This is an expectation the American people should have. Are the Americans part of this initial peace process? If so, how many? How many Americans are actually held hostage? How do we have expectations? If we get one back, is that everyone? Again, he said there are 5 Americans that were held hostage. 2 already came home. 3, he mentioned in this speech. Are we to assume that the other 18 Americans are dead? What happened? We need to understand this.
Thank you all for listening. I'll take a few questions.
Now come the questions which I think are critical to understand. What exactly will the news media ask of him, and how will he respond?
We don't know when that will occur, but we expect it to occur.
We expect it to occur when? When will Americans be released? How many Americans are held hostage and being used as human shields and are being tortured as we speak? How many and when?
And we don't know what the list of all the hostages are and when they'll be released, but we know the numbers when they're going to be released. So it's my hope and expectation will be soon.
But he hasn't set the expectation for Americans to understand how many are in danger and how many might be released from that danger.
We don't know all the conditions.
So we don't know how many hostages are dead. Again, this sets the stage of what our expectations are. So there may be more than 33 Americans that were killed by Hamas. This is important. This is important to the Democratic Socialists of America, to the college students at Harvard, at Columbia, at Cornell University, Americans across this nation, especially those who are pro-Hamas. They should understand that the scope of the damage, the death, and destruction that Hamas has inflicted on the world And this is important for us to understand. But Joe Biden isn't giving us that expectation because he's afraid it will reflect on him poorly in terms of politics and the 2024 election. Let's go on.
I've encouraged the Prime Minister to focus on trying to reduce the number of casualties while he is attempting to eliminate Hamas, which is the legitimate objective he has. That's a difficult task, and I don't know how long it will take. My expectation and hope is that as we move forward, the rest of the Arab world and the region is also putting pressure on all sides to slow this down, to bring this to an end.
Let's be very clear. The expectation for Israel, as they have declared, is that this war will continue for another month, possibly 2 months. That is what has been reported internationally. There is no reason to believe that Israel has changed their opinion, at least at this point. The pressure from the rest of the Middle East isn't influencing this because the rest of the Middle East hates Israel. Israel really isn't interested in most of their opinions, especially that of Iran and any of the nations or terrorist organizations that are aligned with Iran. So there is that part of it. Now, yes, we do hope that Israel is able to remove Hamas or most of the influence of Hamas with as few casualties as possible for other non-combatants. But it's a war. There will be some. We hope that it's a minimum number, but we don't know because Hamas has no problem committing casualties against their own people, and Iran doesn't care at all.
As quickly as we can. I think the chances are real. Well, I think that's a worthwhile thought, but I don't think if I started off with that, we'd ever gotten to where we are today. We have to take this a piece at a time.
Mr. President, do you trust Hamas?
I don't trust Hamas to do anything right. I only trust Hamas to respond to pressure.
And yet, he has no faith in Hamas, and yet all of his discussion relies on Hamas actually living up to the negotiations they've made. It's kind of interesting.
I'm hearing a lot, but I'm not going to speak to it right now.
Well, that's not very encouraging, that he's hearing a lot from other world leaders, which the international news has reported consistently since October, that they are angry with Israel, that they are, even though they don't want any of the Palestinians as refugees, even though they don't want to actually have any support for Palestine, they're angry with Israel in defending itself. So that hasn't changed. And the path towards peace that started with the Abraham Accords and was continued with negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, that's all stalled. The most important thing, again, we believe that Biden can do at this moment is to help encourage Saudi Arabia to restart and continue the talks with Israel towards peace and to influence Iran such that they stop promoting Hamas in their attacks against Israel. That's the best he could do.
There's an overwhelming desire on the part of the region to, let me back up. I cannot prove what I'm about to say, but I believe one of the reasons why Hamas struck when they did was they knew that I was working very closely with the Saudis and others in the region to bring peace to the region by having recognition of Israel and Israel's right to exist.
There's a reason why he said he cannot prove this statement, because it's not real, because there's no credibility to that statement. That is his opinion, that isn't backed by any factual evidence. What we knew in September is that Israel had continued the Abraham Accords, which were started under President Trump, that they had continued those negotiations with Saudi Arabia, and that they were nearing a peace deal with Saudi Arabia, which had nothing to do with the Biden administration whatsoever. And in fact, in September, approximately a week before the Hamas attacked on October 7th, Saudi Arabia had decided to reach out to the United States, NATO, and the UN, and to sweeten the deal with that they were trying to make with Israel by lowering the price of oil, increasing the production of oil amongst the OPEC nations, and reducing the price of oil to help with the economies of NATO, the United States, and the allies of Israel, to help bolster their support for Saudi Arabia in this peace deal that was not supported by the rest of the Middle East. So this has nothing to do with Joe Biden. It has nothing to do with Joe Biden. It has everything to do with Israel, Saudi Arabia. It has to do with oil and energy prices and the international economy. And it has to do with Iran, that would have suffered by the lowering of cost of oil and the greater abundance of oil in the world of their enemy, Saudi Arabia, having allies with Israel and the United States and NATO and the UN. That the influence of peace in the Middle East is bad for Iran and their fanatical views of religion. That's the reality. It has nothing to do with Joe Biden. The reason why he's saying it was about his peace deal, which it isn't, is for his supporters, his far leftist voting base, to continue to support him in 2024. This is purely about the election, about getting votes. This is propaganda. It has no basis in reality. And that's why he said, I can't prove this. Yes, Joe Biden, you can't prove it because there is no factual basis to make that assumption. All facts that exist and that are known say you're wrong. You're just flat out wrong.
You may recall when we did the G20 a little while ago, I was able to get a resolution, a statement passed through there saying we're going to build a railroad from Riyadh all the way through the Middle East into Saudi Arabia, Israel, etc., and all the way up to Europe. Not the railroad, but it would be an underground pipeline and then railroad. The whole idea is there's overwhelming interest, and I think most Arab nations know it, in coordinating with one another to change the dynamic in the region for longer-term peace. And that is what I'm going to continue to work on. Thank you all very, very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving to you all. I hope you enjoyed it.
And I noticed that once the questions started getting tough, where they're asking for Joe Biden to have accountability, both in what his policies were before, during, and since the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas, Joe Biden decided to end the conversation. It's not that he answered the questions clearly. It's that once we start delving into this, once we start looking into the details, what he said is filled with conjecture. I am very sure that Joe Biden didn't want to stay there and keep taking questions after he just made up his influence and his ability to promote peace in the Middle East, which doesn't exist. But this is what happens when we do a detailed look. The mainstream media is going to chop this up. They're going to give you 3 or 4 words. They're going to give you 30-second sound bites and say, this was fantastic. This is Joe Biden being tough and aggressive and leading the world. And it's not real. It's not accurate. When we actually look at what he has said, we see a weak president, weak leadership, and someone who is not helping to bring, let me rephrase that, someone who is not bringing an emphasis of peace and a resolution to this conflict. We don't see that in Joe Biden. But this is the way that we see this. How do you see it?
obey and believe.
I'm happy to be here with you today. Understand the logic, and we see this in social media on a regular basis, and it's something that Newsweek decided not to tell you about. Representative Sheila Jackson-Lee has no idea what she's talking about.
You can meet a very, very stringent accuracy rate when it's important, when it matters, like in federal elections.